Vimy. Shane, 28, chef at a restaurant in the city, been at it for 6 years. Not fine dining, no tasting menus, no wait list that takes months. Just a solid place, honest food, regulars who've sat in the same booths for years. The kind of kitchen where the head chef has been doing this longer than some of the line cooks have been alive. He's not a yeller, doesn't need to be. The expectations are just known. If you're on the line, you move, you call. You don't stand there weighing things while a dish loses heat. I learned in the first year that hesitation in a kitchen is just a slower kind of failure. A dish either goes out or it doesn't. A call either gets made or the whole line backs up behind it. I internalize that faster than most things I've been taught. It's not glamorous work, but it's mine, and I'm good at it. There is something straightforward about a job where the quality of your decisions is visible within minutes. You don't have to wait for a review cycle to know if you got it right. Off the clock, I'm a different person, in the obvious ways. I'm not calling out orders at home, not running timers on everything. But the underlying thing, that instinct to move something from idea to actual reality, that doesn't switch off. If something needs to be figured out, I figure it out. If a plan needs to exist, I make it exist. It's not that I think I have uniquely correct judgment about restaurants or weekend activities. It's just that standing around waiting for things to organize themselves has never worked out for anyone I've watched. Try it. Some people read that differently. I came to understand later. Met Leah at a birthday thing for someone we both knew. I can't pinpoint exactly when this was. The apartment was crowded the way those things always are. I ended up near the kitchen out of pure habit. She was nearby with a few people, and we started talking. She teaches Pilates, has built her own client list over a few years, does online stuff around wellness. We talked for a good 2 or 3 hours that night. I got her number before I left. She texted first a day or two later, which I always read as a good sign. We got coffee, then dinner the following week, and from there things took shape without much friction. I liked her quickly, which is not always how it goes for me. I'd been single for close to 2 years before that, not by plan, just how things had gone. One serious relationship before Leah lasted close to 3 years, ended slowly. No dramatic incident, just a long and steady diminishing that taught me what it actually feels like to keep putting in effort after something has already decided to end. Took me a while after that to stop measuring new things against what that one had felt like. Leah made it easier to stop doing that. She was warm and had her own opinions on things and didn't seem to need me to be anything specific. The first several months together were genuinely uncomplicated. I'd have an idea, make the plan, tell her, and she'd be there. She'd occasionally suggest something herself, and we'd do that instead. It wasn't me controlling the shape of things. It was just how we moved. I booked restaurants, sorted out weekends, picked what we were seeing or where we were going. There was a weekend we drove a couple hours to a spot she'd mentioned wanting to see. I'd looked it up, figured out where to stop for food on the way, had a route. She'd said something like she couldn't believe I'd actually planned the whole thing. Said it like that was remarkable. I didn't know what to say to that. I just said it didn't take long to look up. But that was the texture of the early months. Things happening, her seeming happy that they happened, me not overthinking it. She made comments about it that I took as positive. Things like she liked that I actually did things instead of just talking about doing them. That it felt easy being with me because days didn't just drift. I accepted all of that at face value. Her social media during this period was wellness content, Pilates things, that general lane. Somewhere around 8 or 9 months in, I started noticing the tone of it changing. More posts about recognizing patterns, about reclaiming your voice, about what healthy dynamics look like. I'm not much on social media myself, so I only saw it when she mentioned something. Her close friend, another instructor she worked with fairly often, started coming up in conversation more. I'd met her friend a couple of times at group things. Seemed fine. Nothing that made a strong impression either way. They'd apparently been spending more time together, talking more. I filed that away without thinking much about it. The evening things actually started because I'd made a reservation. The Italian place near my apartment. She'd mentioned wanting to go back months earlier. I remembered. I made the booking. I told her that evening we were leaving at 8. She stopped and looked at me in a way she hadn't before. Not cold, more like she'd been sitting with something, and this had finally given her the opening. She asked if I'd thought about asking her first. I said we'd talked about wanting to go back before. She said that wasn't what she was asking. What came after that was longer than I expected. She said she'd been thinking about how things worked between us, that her friend had helped her see something she hadn't noticed on her own. She said, looking at us from the outside, it was me driving everything and her following, that she hadn't realized how much of that she'd accepted without thinking. She said she'd been doing some reading, talking things through. She'd come to understand that what I'd been doing, making plans and announcing them, was actually a form of not treating her as an equal. She talked about toxic masculinity, about how men who default to leadership do it because they need to feel like they're in charge, not because they're actually trying to help. That the appearance of being helpful and the reality of needing control were easy to confuse from the inside. She said it wasn't about whether I was a good person. It was about a pattern that needed to stop. I want to be honest about what that felt like to hear. I'd been planning things for 10 months because it seemed to make her happy. Now I was being told that the exact behavior she'd called good was actually evidence of something wrong. I sat with that for a moment, then asked what she wanted specifically. She said equal partnership, decisions made together, no more me just setting the direction and expecting her to follow. I thought about it for a few seconds, then said, "Okay, that's what we'll do." She looked like she'd prepared for more resistance and didn't know what to do without it. We went to dinner because the reservation was already there. Had a decent time, talked about other things. I drove home thinking this was a straightforward adjustment. She wanted to feel consulted, wanted to be part of the decisions. Those are fair things to want. I told myself starting that week I'd hold ideas as ideas and bring them to her as questions instead of announcements. We'd pick things together and move from there. Starting that week, I did exactly that. I stopped making unilateral plans. If something came to mind, I'd sit on it and bring it up when we had time to talk about it together. I figured we'd fall into a back and forth pretty naturally. The first time it didn't work was 4 or 5 days later. We had a free evening. I asked what she wanted to do. She threw out a few options and asked which I preferred. I said I was honestly open to any of them. She said that wasn't helpful. I said it was true. She pushed for a real answer. I gave one. She said she wasn't sure about that one. I said okay, then pick from the rest. She thought about it. Said she wasn't sure about those either. We stayed in. It wasn't a fight. The evening just had no air in it. I made food at some point. She was on her phone. We talked about nothing specific. She went home. I told myself it was one evening and we'd get better at it. A few days after that, she asked what I felt like for the weekend. I listed a few things, asked which sounded good to her. She said she wasn't sure. She'd been tired from a busy week with clients. I said we could do something low-key, gave 2 easy options. She said either was fine. I said okay, pick the one you'd prefer. She said I should just pick. I said I was trying not to do that. She looked at me like the whole conversation was exhausting her. Said she just meant for me to pick a restaurant, not every decision for the rest of our lives. I said I didn't know where the line was anymore. She made a sound that wasn't quite a response and changed the subject. We ended up going somewhere. I think she named it eventually, and the evening was fine. But the texture of how we got there was becoming a familiar kind of draining. The following weekend was the first time I started seeing the actual shape of the problem. I had 2 days off back to back, which is unusual for my schedule. I'd left both of them completely clear on purpose, no plans, waiting for us to figure something out together. She came over in the morning. We had coffee, talked about nothing in particular for a while. At some point, the question of what to do with the day came up. I laid out a few options I'd been sitting on, some places we hadn't been, a market in a part of the city neither of us had checked out. She said her legs were sore from teaching the day before. Hiking was probably too much. I took hiking off the table and said, what about the other options? She asked what I actually wanted. I said I wanted to do whatever worked for her. She went back to her phone. I sat there trying to find the path through, some way to move us toward a decision that didn't look like me deciding. I couldn't locate that angle. About an hour passed. She eventually said we should just walk somewhere nearby and get lunch. I said absolutely, let's go, and I meant it. We did that. Had a genuinely fine afternoon. But the mechanics of how we got there meant something. The day didn't start until she stopped waiting and made a call. This time, it was her. She'd done the thing she'd asked me to stop doing. Not because it was controlling, but because it was the only way anything was going to happen. I noticed that and let it sit. I didn't bring it up. There was no version of me saying that out loud that didn't turn into a longer argument. Sunday ran along the same lines. Slow start, nothing settled, eventual small plan that came together fine, but only after we'd used the better part of the day getting there. I went back to work that week with that pattern in my head. My coworker picked up that I was quieter than usual during a slower part of the service. He's been working alongside me for a few years and has a way of listening without jumping straight to advice. I gave him the short version. He let me get through it. Afterward, he said what I was describing sounded like a setup where neither option was actually available. Lead and it's control. Don't lead and nothing moves, and I'm still somehow the problem. I said that was roughly it from where I was standing. He asked how long I was planning to stay in that. I said I was still figuring it out. He said fair enough, and we got back to the line. I thought about that question for the rest of the shift. The answer I kept landing on was that I didn't know. Not because I was unhappy exactly, more because I was in a situation where I couldn't tell what winning looked like. What I did know was that I was good at my job, and my job required me to make calls constantly. I could run a kitchen line during a Saturday rush and keep everything moving without losing a dish. But I couldn't figure out how to get from a Wednesday evening to a Thursday without someone being unhappy about something. That gap felt strange to carry around. The weeks that followed were more of the same, but the pressure behind it kept building. Leah started saying I seemed distant. I said I was tired from work, which was partly true. She said it was more than that. She could feel something missing. I asked what presence looked like to her right now, given everything. She said making plans, initiating things, being the one who reached out. I pointed out that I'd been suggesting things, and she hadn't committed to any of them. She said that was because she wasn't always up for a lot. I said I wasn't always up for a lot either, and I still showed up with something. She didn't answer that directly. I let the quiet sit for a moment and then changed the subject. There were a handful of evenings like that over the following weeks. She'd arrive carrying something she hadn't named yet. I'd spend part of the time trying to figure out what had tipped it. Sometimes I could identify it, something I hadn't initiated, a plan that hadn't existed. Sometimes I genuinely couldn't find the source, I stopped trying to read the room as precisely after a while. Not because I stopped caring, but because I couldn't fix something I couldn't locate. Around this time, the grocery store thing happened. I want to mention it because it locked something into focus. We were doing the regular weekly shop, nothing out of the ordinary. Standing in front of the dairy section, she asked which yogurt to grab. I said any of them was fine, she should pick. She stared at me like I'd done something specific and wrong. Said she couldn't believe I couldn't pick a yogurt. I said I was trying not to be the one making decisions for us, which is what she'd asked. She said that was completely different from a yogurt. I asked her to help me understand where the line was. She said I knew where the line was. I said genuinely the line had gotten blurry for me, that I couldn't tell anymore what counted as making a decision without her versus just having a preference. She grabbed a yogurt without an answering and walked ahead for the rest of the trip. I pushed the cart and kept quiet. I wasn't angry about it, more like tired in a specific way. The kind of tired that comes from trying to do the right thing and not being able to figure out what the right thing is. Her friend was more present in our conversations now without ever being physically there. Leah would mention her friend's take on something, and it would become part of whatever we were discussing. The framework her friend seemed to operate from was one I was starting to understand pretty well. If a man leads, it's because he can't tolerate not being in charge. If a man stops leading after being asked to, he's punishing the person who asked. There was no position in that framework where a man was just trying to comply with what he'd been told and getting it wrong. It was always something darker underneath. I watched that lens make its way into how Leah read me. Things I'd been doing for almost a year without comment now had interpretations attached to them. I came home after a long double shift one night and was too worn down to suggest dinner plans. She said I was withdrawing. I suggested trying a new place near her apartment a few days later, somewhere that had gotten good reviews. She said I'd made a decision without asking. I said I was asking now. That was the point of mentioning it before doing it. She said the energy behind it was different from genuinely asking. I thought about that for a while after. I genuinely tried to understand what the difference felt like from her end. But I couldn't get there. A suggestion is a suggestion. If the suggestion itself is acceptable, but the energy behind it is the problem, then I don't have the tools to fix that. I don't know how to suggest something in a way that doesn't carry any trace of wanting to do it. I don't know how to modulate the energy behind a dinner suggestion. I don't know what that distinction even means in practice. And I'd stopped asking for clarification because asking always opened a longer conversation that didn't end anywhere useful. Her friend's framing would come in through Leah, and the answer was always some version of I'd understand if I was actually trying. I noticed Leah's posts had gotten more frequent around this time. More pieces about control dressed up as care, about men who look helpful until you pay closer attention. Nothing pointed at me, nothing named. Just a general current that flowed through our conversations. I kept going to work, kept the same level there, came home and existed in what was left. At home, things were just drifting. There wasn't a fight exactly, just a persistent low pressure with no release. The work dinner thing came up around this stretch. A coworker was celebrating something, putting together a small group for drinks after a shift. I mentioned it to Leah, said it was that Friday, asked if she wanted to come. She asked whether I wanted to go. I said I didn't mind going. It was casual, a couple of hours. She asked again, wanted to know if I actually wanted to be there. I said the honest answer was that I was indifferent. It would be a fine enough time either way. She said indifference wasn't a real answer. I said it was the most accurate one I had. She pointed out that I used to just say yes, or make a call about these things, and now I never did. I said I was trying to apply what she'd asked me to apply. She said it felt deliberate. I said it wasn't, and I meant that. We went back and forth and ended up not going. I gave the coworker a vague excuse at work. He didn't push it, just said no problem. Leah hadn't seemed particularly bothered that we'd skipped it, but she also hadn't suggested anything in its place, which I noticed. I kept filing these things away without saying anything. The count was getting long. Times I'd brought something up and she'd deflected. Times she'd been upset that nothing had happened, and I'd been the one standing there holding the blame for it. I'm not someone who keeps score as a habit, but when the pattern is consistent enough, it becomes hard not to see the shape of it. The month or so after that was a quieter version of the same dynamic. She'd have evenings where she seemed like she wanted something to happen and nothing did. I'd wait and nothing happened. She'd go home and the next day would be fine. Then it would happen again. I started spending more of my evenings just inside my own routine, watching things I'd had in a backlog, cooking for myself, reading after work, not cutting her off, just not sitting around waiting for something to materialize that wasn't going to materialize. At work, I was the same, calling things, moving fast, getting things done. There was a satisfaction in that I wasn't getting anywhere else. She noticed the change at home, said I seemed checked out. I said I was decompressing after long shifts, which was true. She said it was more than that she could feel me not being there even when I was there. I said I didn't know what to tell her. She said that was kind of the problem. I could have said something longer to that, but I let it go. There was a conversation sometime in there that was longer and more structured than the others. She came over with the look people get when they've been going over what they want to say for a while. She sat down and told me she'd been talking to her friend a lot, that her friend had helped her put words to something she'd been feeling. She said she'd been doing more reading about relationship patterns, about what toxic masculinity looks like when it's not obvious. Said the kind of man who always takes the lead does it because he needs to feel superior, whether he knows it or not. The behavior is the tell, regardless of what the person thinks their motive is. She said it wasn't about me being evil. It was about a learned pattern that caused harm regardless of intent. I listened to the whole thing. It took a while to get through. When she finished, I asked if she actually believed that was what I was doing. She said she didn't know, but the pattern was there regardless of motive. I asked her to describe what a healthy version of what we had would look like in practical terms. She said a partnership where both people felt empowered. I sat with that for a second. I said, what does empowered look like on a specific evening when one person asks the other what they want to do and they can't decide? She said both people contribute. I said we'd been trying that for weeks, and the result kept being that nothing happened. I said that seemed like the relevant data point, and I didn't know how to interpret it except to say the system wasn't working. She said I wasn't really trying. I was just waiting for her to fail. That one caught me off guard. I said I was waiting for one of us to actually make a move, which was the only thing I'd been waiting for. She said her friend had told her that the way I'd been behaving since she asked for change was textbook passive aggression. I asked what evidence her friend had for that specific read. She didn't have a specific answer. Said her friend understood these patterns very well. I said I wasn't being passive-aggressive. I was being exactly as compliant as I knew how to be with what she'd asked. That I didn't know how to be more compliant without just doing nothing at all. She said compliance wasn't the same as being a real partner. I said I was trying to figure out what a real partner looked like in a situation where the old behavior was wrong and the new behavior also seemed to be wrong. She didn't have a direct response to that, said she needed me to just try harder. I said I'd think about it. That was true. I would think about it. She seemed like that was enough for now, and we moved on. The weeks after that conversation were quiet in a way that was different from the tension before it. Not better exactly, more like we'd both found a lower gear. We saw each other, we talked, nothing blew up, but nothing was particularly warm either. I was still making the same small calculations every time we had a free evening. Check my instinct to just decide something, wait and see if she picks up the thread, watch the evening flatten out when neither happens. I stopped expecting it to feel different. The mountain trip had been sitting in the background through all of this. It had started as something I'd mentioned back when I was still the one who moved things from thought to plan. Driving up to a mountain area a few hours from the city, renting a place for a long weekend, getting out of the routine. She'd been enthusiastic about the idea when I first brought it up. I'd looked at some options quietly, checked a few cabins, thought about timing. Then the Italian restaurant conversation happened, and I stopped advancing it. I figured if she wanted to go, she'd pick up the thread. Over the weeks that followed, she mentioned it a few times. Said it would be nice to get away, that we still hadn't done that mountain thing. I'd say yes, it sounded good. Nothing would happen from either direction. Weeks passed. She mentioned it again. Same response from me, same outcome. I'd stopped counting the times we'd nodded at the idea without moving toward it. The window we'd loosely had in mind was closing in. I watched the dates approach, checked availability on the places I'd looked at before, just out of habit, not with any plan attached. Still open, still reasonable. I said nothing. She said nothing. I want to be clear about what I was thinking during this stretch. I wasn't holding back to make a point or prove something. I was genuinely working from the assumption that if she wanted to go, she'd say, "Let's actually do this." I'd spent months watching a plan not happen because I'd stopped driving it. What I wanted to understand was what happened if neither of us drove it. Was the issue that I'd been driving, or was the issue that nobody drives and things just stay where they are? I didn't ask Leah this question directly. I already knew the conversation it would open. So I waited. The answer was that nothing happened. One evening, she came over and asked in a casual enough way whether we were still thinking about that trip that weekend. I asked if she'd looked into anything. The change in her posture was immediate. She said I was the one who'd originally brought it up. I said that was true, and that I'd been waiting to see if she wanted to take it somewhere. She said she hadn't known she was supposed to be the one to do that. I said I hadn't known there were established rules about who was supposed to. And then it went sideways faster than any conversation before it. She said I'd been setting her up the whole time, that I'd created a dynamic where no matter what she did, she was going to fail. I said I hadn't set anything up deliberately. She said intent didn't change the result. I asked her to name something she'd wanted in the past couple of months that hadn't happened, because I'd stopped it. She listed things. I went through each one. Every item on the list had a version where I'd brought up something connected, and she hadn't committed to it. She had a separate explanation for each one, why that particular instance was different, why it didn't count. I asked her then to point to a time she'd made a plan, and I hadn't shown up for it. She thought about it for a long stretch of silence. Couldn't name one. Said that wasn't the point. I asked what the point was then. She said real partnership isn't about counting who moved last. It's about both people wanting to move. I said I agreed with that completely. I also said that for months I'd watched both of us wait for the other one to move first, and nothing had happened. And I was having trouble understanding how that was only my fault. She said I was the one who knew how to do it. I'd done it for a year. Stopping wasn't neutral. I said stopping was what she'd asked for. She said she hadn't asked me to stop caring. I said I hadn't stopped caring. I'd stopped making unilateral plans, which were not the same thing. We went back and forth on that for a while and didn't arrive anywhere. Then she took out her phone and called her friend, right there in the kitchen, on speaker, while I stood there. Her friend explained the concept of engaged initiative, the idea that a healthy partner moves toward things out of genuine care rather than out of a need to be in charge. That the difference between the two was visible if you knew what to look for. Her friend said my response to being asked for equality had followed a pattern she'd seen before, consistent with men who can't function in an equal relationship and use withdrawal as a way of reasserting that nothing happens without them. I asked for a concrete example of what engaged initiative looked like when you asked someone what they wanted and they couldn't decide. Her friend said I was being deflective. I said I was asking a specific question and would appreciate a specific answer. There was a pause on the line. Her friend said the demand for concrete examples was itself a deflection, a way of setting an impossible bar so I could justify doing nothing. I said I'd been trying to do what I was asked, and the problem seemed to be that what I was asked wasn't possible to execute. Her friend said that if I genuinely cared, I'd figure it out without needing a manual. I said that was a nice principle that didn't give me anything to work with. Leah ended the call. The kitchen went quiet. She looked genuinely upset, not performing it, actually sitting with something uncomfortable. Said she didn't know how we'd ended up in this place. I said I didn't either, and I meant something different by that than she did. She meant, why was I making it so hard? I meant, why had the basic act of being in a relationship become something I had to navigate like a minefield? I didn't say that out loud. She went home not long after. I sat at the kitchen table for a while after she left. Not angry, just going over things. Then I opened my laptop, pulled up the cabin sites I'd looked at months earlier, found a place, still available, that Saturday through Sunday evening, reasonable price for what it was. Read the listing twice, put in my card details, got the confirmation email, closed the laptop, went to bed, slept better than I had in a while. That felt like information worth noting. The next afternoon, she texted about the weekend. I called instead of texting back, told her I'd booked a cabin in the mountains, leaving Saturday morning, back Sunday evening. Silence on the line for a few seconds. Then she said I'd done it again, made a decision without her. I said yes. She asked why, after all of it. I said because I'd wanted to go, and under the arrangement we'd had for the past several months, it was never going to happen on its own. She asked if she was just supposed to show up to a trip she hadn't been part of planning. I said she was welcome to come. I'd assumed she would, but if she didn't want to come, that was her call. She said she needed to think about it. I said to let me know before I went to sleep. She didn't call back. I packed a bag that evening. Nothing complicated. 2 days of clothes, boots, a book that had been sitting on my shelf. She texted late, after I was already in bed. Asked if this was me giving up on us. I read it, put the phone down without answering. In the morning, I got up early, loaded the car, made coffee to take with me, sent her a message before leaving, said I wasn't giving up on anything, I was going to the mountains, that I cared about her, but I couldn't keep existing inside a dynamic where nothing was allowed to move. Reread it once before sending. It said what I meant, which was all I could ask of it. Left without waiting for a reply. 3 hours of driving with my phone on the passenger seat face down. Felt it vibrate a few times and left it where it was. I don't know if that was the right call, but I needed the drive to be a drive and not an argument through a screen. The mountains were overcast when I arrived, which I preferred. Something about the flat gray sky made the place feel quieter than it would have in full sun. The cabin was small and matched the photos, nothing misleading about it. Checked in, dropped my bag, went straight out on a trail. Walked for 2 hours, without any particular direction in mind, the kind of walking where your legs just work and your head goes somewhere else. I thought about the kitchen, about the Saturday's service I was missing. I thought about the coworker asking how long I was planning to stay in it. Came back, cooked something simple on the small stove the cabin had, ate outside even though it was cool. Read for a while before going to sleep. I went through the messages that night sitting on the porch before bed, several from Leah, moving through different versions of upset. Some of them asked why I'd done it. A few said I was being selfish. One asked whether I even wanted to be in a relationship. The last few had shifted in tone, quieter, like the initial reaction had run its course, and she was somewhere else. Her friend had sent something that Leah had forwarded through, a fairly long passage about men who use passivity as a tool, about how stepping back in response to being asked for equity was itself a form of control, a way of asserting that nothing moves without the man's participation, about how that behavior traced back to a kind of toxic masculinity that expressed itself through absence rather than action. I read it all the way through, thought about it for a while. The argument was internally consistent. If you start from the assumption that men step back only to reassert control, then everything I'd done for the past several months fit the theory. The problem is that the theory doesn't leave room for the possibility that I was just doing what I'd been asked. If every action is evidence and every inaction is also evidence, there's no behavior that disproves anything. I wasn't angry about the message, more tired of the same loop arriving in different packages. Set my phone on the nightstand, watched the dark outside for a while, then went to sleep. In the morning, I went out on a longer trail, the kind where you stop thinking about anything because the terrain requires attention. Came back to the cabin in the afternoon, drove home Sunday evening, stopped somewhere for food on the way, got back to my apartment, unpacked, got ready for the next morning. She came over 2 days later. The conversation was different from everything that had come before it. Not a fight, not two people holding their positions. She said she'd spent the weekend actually thinking instead of reacting, that when I'd left without her, without waiting, something had shifted for her. She said at first she'd been angry, that it had felt like exactly the thing she'd been talking about for months. But sitting with it longer, she'd started to notice something else. She said she'd realized she hadn't made a single plan the entire time we'd been doing the equal decision thing. Not one. That she'd been watching me for signs of control so closely that she'd stopped actually wanting things out loud. That she'd turned her own preferences off to keep the principle running. I said I'd noticed. She said she knew, and that it hadn't been fair to either of us. We talked about her friend for a bit, not with blame, more like she was naming something clearly for the first time. She said she'd taken her friend's framework and applied it to everything, even where it didn't fit. That it had taken things I did out of habit, out of how I was built, and turned them into something suspicious. That she'd been so focused on the idea of what the relationship was supposed to look like that she'd stopped paying attention to what it actually was. I listened to that and didn't add to it. Just let her say what she was saying. She asked at the end of it if I was done with us. I told her I genuinely didn't know yet. That was the true answer, and I wasn't going to give her a different one to make the conversation easier to sit in. She said she understood, then asked what would help me know. I said time and space to think without the same pressure. She said, okay. She left that night without knowing what was coming. I sat with it after she left, not trying to reach a conclusion, just letting it be what it was. I'd been in enough kitchens to know that some things need time and you can't rush them. A sauce either reduces right or it doesn't. Forcing the heat just ruins it. I don't know if this is something that reduces right. I still don't know entirely. What I know is that the shape we were in for those months isn't something I'm going back to. Where every move I made was evidence of something wrong underneath it. Where both of us stood still and waited for the other one to stop being a problem. If there's a version after this, it needs both people to actually move toward things. Not one person holding still and watching the other one for patterns. Not both people holding still and watching the days go by. Both people moving. That's the part I'm clear on. The rest, I'm still working out. Be me. Shane went to the mountains anyway. Figured out the opposite of control isn't paralysis. Figured out that two people standing still, waiting for the other one to move, is just a different kind of stuck. Still deciding what to do with that.